My name is Lawrence Holmes. I was born in 1935 and I run Veryan Bunker's Museum. I am also a member of the Royal Observer Corps Association. No sooner had the Cuban crisis developed and we were getting quite nervous than it was over, because it's now history that both Kennedy and Khrushchev actually backed off. They withdrew the missiles from Turkey and Cuba, and the threat of a third nuclear war diminished. But it had been a warning, and I think from the Cuban crisis onwards, the Observer Corps was much more acutely aware of the possibility, and more important, they were acutely aware of the importance of the nuclear role that they were performing. When you think that that nuclear role, no other organisation was reporting the details to nuclear weapons and radioactive fallout, no other organisation was doing the plotting for what the country would look like with several nuclear weapons detonated on it and radioactive fallout spreading all over the place. And that was in the hands, by and large, of a spare time volunteer organisation. It's actually quite mind-boggling when you study it in its entirety. But we were, I have to say at this point that the Observer Corps, partly if not mostly due to the RAF training, was a tremendously professional group of people. We were trained very well, and we had got probably the best esprit de corps of any organisation in the United Kingdom. The Observer Corps personnel were so enthusiastic, and although they'd got ordinary jobs by day, they would have done almost anything for the Observer Corps. And that was a unique feature of the Corps from the early days, quite honestly, whether it was aircraft reporting or nuclear reporting, and that continued right to stand down.
How would you have been called into service? So if the Cold War had gone hot in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, how would you have been called into service at that point?
Well, every unit of the Observer Corps had an emergency planning plan. The idea being that had the need arisen from central government for the Observer Corps to be put on a war footing, and don't forget, the Observer Corps wouldn't have been alone in that. Every organisation would have been put on a war footing. But the message would have gone down from central government to headquarters ROC, down to the groups, who would then have phoned around the group officers, because there was this cascading system of organisation. And ultimately, the observers out in their homes at local level would have received the message to man their posts. Now, we did have several exercises, emergency manning exercises, called Fandango. And we actually practiced this emergency manning. We were supposed to not know anything about it. In other words, we were supposed to think that it was all going to come, suddenly. And it may have come when a lot of people were at work. It was accepted that the Observer Corps was a spare time organisation, so almost every Fandango actually happened at a weekend to give us a chance to man effectively. But at its best, a Fandango proved that on receipt of the emergency manning instruction, the whole of the Corps could be mobilised in 2 hours. Now, for a spare time organisation, that's not bad going.
So, if it had happened for real, and the code word had been given, you had been mobilised, emotionally, what would you have been thinking when you were leaving your house, perhaps for the last time? You'd said goodbye to your family, perhaps for the last time, and you are now on your way to active service. Did you ever try to prepare yourself for that eventuality, emotionally?
It's true to say probably we didn't, seriously. One of the reasons is that most of us simply did not think it would happen. And when you are trained to carry out a professional job. You know you can do it, but you don't think it'll happen. There's only part of you actually begins to wonder, what would happen, or how would I be if I did get that call to man? And that's what you're asking me. I would like to think that I, and indeed most of the Observer Corps volunteers, would have manned. I'm convinced I would. I would have actually said goodbye to my wife and family. I would have tried to make sure that they were okay at home before I left, but I would have gone to my place of work in the Observer Corps. I'm convinced I would have done that. There are people who would say the Observer Corps would have only achieved a 30, 40, 50% manning rate. I don't believe that. I think it would have achieved a much higher manning rate. Don't forget, there are all sorts of scenarios. If the Corps was put on a war footing, would the war happen, nuclear war? Would the nuclear war happen immediately? Would it happen in 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months? Because if there was a time lapse between manning in earnest and the war actually starting, the crews of the Observer Corps were arranged in shifts of 8 hours. So one crew would go on for 8 hours, they would go home, another crew would go on, they would go home, another crew would go on. And of course, if the bomb went off, at any point in that process, the only crew serving would be the one that was on duty at that time. It follows that 2/3 of the ROC personnel, who were fully trained and fully prepared to man their posts, would never actually serve in a nuclear war. Thankfully, none of us ever served in a nuclear war.
So what about your family life, and how did Royal Observer Corps work impact on family life at home?
When I joined the Corps, I was single. I got married in 1960. And of course, because I had to live a normal life at home, I had to work, I had to earn money, I had to buy a house. And it's normal when a man and woman marry that they have children. And I did all that. And as a hobby, and I will call it a hobby, I joined the Royal Observer Corps. Now, just like some people go to the pub, or some people join the camera club, I joined the Royal Observer Corps. It so happened that we had a deadly serious role, but it was very much in part a club. And we were encouraged to actually create a sense of friendship, a sense of sociability. We had dances, we had dinners, we had parties, not all the time, but we were encouraged to not only work well together, but actually play well together. And that was an important ingredient. And I was doing all that simultaneously. When I went to Royal Observer Corps meetings, I think it's fair to say it depended on the individual how serious you were. You could be perhaps jovial and frivolous at home, or when you went to the football match or whatever. And some people, actually, when they attended Royal Observer Corps meetings, carried on that frivolity. But the majority actually almost changed somewhat and became quite serious. And so you had a sort of, I won't say a Jekyll and Hyde character, but you did change for that meeting period into doing something quite serious. But yes, we had to exist in our normal life, actually much more, because in time terms, I spent much more time operating a family and going to work than I did in the Observer Corps. Don't forget the Observer Corps, my committal was 2 hours a week. Because I was an NCO and then an officer, I actually put in much more than that. But the average observer need only have put in 2 hours, and he was living as a married man the rest of the time.
Were you able to freely discuss, or did you freely discuss your work with your family? Bearing in mind you'd actually signed the Official Secrets Act, how easy was it for you to be able to do that? It
was quite easy, really, because although I'd signed the Official Secrets Act, I didn't consider much of what I was doing to be of a secret nature. My wife was well aware that I joined the Observer Corps, and she would ask me what we did, why we were doing it, and indeed she would talk to other wives of other observers, and they would talk. You can't stop people talking together. And they would have a generalised idea of what we did, whether it was aircraft reporting or nuclear reporting. And they knew, my wife knew, that we were taking readings to nuclear weapons and radioactive fallout and drawing maps and things like that. But don't forget, you've got to have a certain mentality to actually like nuclear plotting and drawing nuclear maps. A lot of people would find that quite boring, and it can be boring. And many of the wives were quite prepared to let the husbands go off and play their nuclear war games, and they weren't remotely interested in what they were doing. So the response from a husband who was in the Corps to how much he would tell his wife or talk to his wife about what he did in the Corps depended on her interest as well. In my case, I used to tell my wife quite a bit about it. In fact, I would see the danger signals that she was getting bored and stop telling her anymore.
Were spies considered to be an issue for the Royal Observer Corps, perhaps from the campaign from nuclear disarmament or from even the Soviet Union?
I was certainly in the 1970s and early 80s, I was aware of the activity of peace groups and CND. Don't forget, my training in the Observer Corps made me very proud to be working in the defence of this country. I believed in a good defence, whether that was having the Observer Corps or having V-bombers or Trident missiles or whatever. I still think that Britain should have a good defence. And it rather saddened me in a sense to realise that there was a group of people, generally well-meaning people, who for various reasons felt differently. Some peace groups felt very strongly that we shouldn't have nuclear weapons, that we shouldn't be doing anything to do with nuclear war, and CND were the same. I found it quite strange because at times I did try and explain to some peace group people the fact that we were actually trying to save lives in the Royal Observer Corps by monitoring radioactive fallout and trying to forecast where it was going to go. And but that didn't seem to wash, and they had little understanding, nor were they prepared to understand what we were trying to do. I found it slightly strange when certainly CND would be prepared to use physical force to put over their point. In the Observer Corps, although it never happened to me, we did suffer posts being broken into. There was a post where CND activists set it alight. A favourite was to put some sort of glue or whatever it was in the locking mechanism so the observers couldn't get in. So CND and peace groups did cause a certain amount of trouble for the Observer Corps' activities. I never really liked peace groups or CND's activities in that area. I would never fall out with them. I'd got my views and they had theirs, and that was it.
So how did you see, what was your view of the role of the Royal Observer Corps at that point of the Cold War, or indeed throughout the whole of the Cold War?
Well, our role in the Cold War, primarily, at least from 1955 onwards, was to give warning of air attack, nuclear attack, to plot nuclear weapons, plot radioactive fallout and forecast where fallout was going, with a view to other agencies being able to tell people what to do in the event of a nuclear war or the approach of radioactive fallout. That was our role, theoretically, from 1955 to 1991. And I think that was connected with saving life. And I know enough about it to know that in actual fact, although millions may have been killed in an initial detonation, many millions of lives could have been saved had the track of fallout been known. Thankfully, it was never put to the test, and I'm the first one to say, thanks for that.